they introduced cash crops. And Southerners were convinced that they were making a ton of money off of tobacco, rice, and then eventually by 1800s cotton. Okay? Second reason, immigrants didn't come to the South. The antebellum immigrants are primarily from Ireland and Germany and Northern Europe in general, okay? They came from climates that were much colder than the South, so they didn't like the climate. The Irish and the Germans were opposed to slavery. The good land in the South had been taken up in the 1600s, and you were having to move inland type of thing, except if you wanted to move to the deep South, like Alabama, Mississippi, etc. The other issue is who would be the labor in these factories, where you didn't have immigrants, you were going to have to use slave labor, and there was really concern that those slaves would feel like they were more entitled to freedom and that kind of thing if they weren't working in agriculture. J.D.B. DeBow wrote that the South needed to industrialize, but we know there were very few industries. The one industry they always talk about in the South is the enrichment, armaments. I'll think of it. Anyway, they made like guns and cannons and stuff. Ironworks, I'm sorry. Eventually they made guns and cannons, but they were called the Tredegar Ironworks. Slaves coming to America lost what? What? Well, freedom is obvious because they're slaves. They lost their culture, okay? Their family, their culture, their way of life. Because America got the leftovers, so to speak, often a ship would arrive in Charleston or Richmond, wherever, and they would unload 50 slaves and they might speak 50 different languages. Or maybe 10 people did speak the same language, but they were sold to 10 different plantations. So when you went to a plantation or a farm, you didn't have anybody to speak to, so you had to learn English. They probably lost their religious beliefs. Most slaves coming into America were either animistic, meaning they were polytheistic and worshipped animal spirits, or they were Muslim. And when they came to America, the three things that they fed slaves were corn, molasses, and fatback. And fatback is like really super duper fatty bacon, which is a pork thing, okay? In the Caribbean, it was easier to keep your African culture because you went to large plantations. Remember that in the United States, most people owned fewer than 10 slaves. So, you know, you didn't have the opportunity to be with a lot of other African people, too. How did free blacks gain their freedom? Well, if you were a free black living in the South, of which there were about 250,000, 250,000, you had been manumitted, meaning somebody bought your freedom, whether it was you yourself or you were giving your freedom for a heroic act or deed, or somebody bought it like the American Colonization Society and you didn't get shipped off to Africa. If you lived in Massachusetts, you probably ran away yourself or were a descendant of a runaway slave. Okay, that far north, there wasn't a lot of ammunition. Slaves from Virginia were sold to the Southwest because, or why? Southwest in 1840 is referring to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. And why did we suddenly have a need to sell slaves in those areas? Because they were growing cotton. Okay, remember 1792-3, the cotton gin was invented. It changed the face of slavery forever. In 1785, there were lots of slaves being given their freedom in Virginia and Maryland because they couldn't afford to keep them any longer. By 1800, with the invention of the cotton gin, there's a huge demand for slaves, so rather than just freeing them and creating these free blacks, you sell them because you still support this institution of slavery. And so that's how the cotton gin affected the South and made slaves very valuable. Who was the South's major trading partner before the Civil War? England, actually. They sold more cotton to England than they did to the North, which was the #2 trading partner. Slave trade increased in the United States because, A, the cotton market increased, not because slaves were easier to buy. Slave trade increased in the United States internally because they didn't allow foreign trade also. The nature of slavery, its effects on blacks and whites, it made whites lazy, it gave whites a false sense of superiority, it gave blacks a false sense of inferiority, it forced blacks to live as slaves, work for other people that they didn't want to work for. Okay, this next section, slave owners, percentage of large plantations, most own how many slaves? What percentage of Southerners own slaves? 25%. That is a number you should not forget. It's a great number to throw into an essay, and they often have that as a question. Okay? Sometimes the question is, how many slaves do most Southerners own? And the answer is 0. Okay, most Southerners, 75% of Southerners own 0. Were there lots of large plantations? No. 80% of that 25% of Southerners only owned less than 10 slaves. So out of 25% of the slave owners in the South, 20% owned more than 10. And usually to be considered a large plantation, we're talking, you know, over 50 to 100 slaves at least. So when you think of Gone with the Wind with, you know, like all those big plantations and slaves singing in the field, that's not real. The price of slaves and the effect of that price, slaves were fairly expensive in America. In 1860, to buy an infant was $100. And you couldn't expect that infant to work for 4 or 5 years. To buy a teenager male who could work in the fields, who was young, healthy, and probably a female too, a teenager who was strong and healthy and could bear children, cost you about $1,000. On the average, a bale of cotton, which is a little bit smaller than your desk and not as big as my table here, but a bale of cotton sold for 10 cents a bale. That's a heck of a lot of cotton to buy one individual. So the effect of that price was that actually slaves were treated better in the United States than they were treated in the Caribbean or Latin America. The nature of the slave family, it's really extended, even to beyond non-blood relatives, because your book told you this. Each slave could count on probably 17 family members being sold in his or her lifetime away from them. So what happened is that very often, if parents were sold and the kid was left because there were 10 and the slave owner kept him, he kind of attached, or she attached herself to some older slave and started considering them an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent. Okay? So there's this real sense that we all are family, that you don't have amongst necessarily white society at the time. Were slaves a good investment? Southerners certainly said so. But I think what happens after the Civil War shows that they could have made as equally good money with sharecropping as they did with slaves, and maybe more. Hinton Helper, a Southerner who wrote the book The Impending Crisis of the South, who said that slavery was not an economically sound thing for the South to do. The third piece of literature that a Southerner wrote that is in this area time period was George Fitzhugh, who wrote that everybody who didn't own land should be a slave. And he included northern factory workers should be slaves to the factory.